Okay, so there's like part 3, part 4, part 5 of the Cold War, because the Cold War basically goes on from 1941, and like in the video, y'all saw it goes all the way up into 1991 when what falls apart? The Berlin Wall, and we will see eventually the Soviet Union will fall apart because Mikhail Gorbachev will start introducing 2 ideas that will lead to the downfall of communism called perestroika and glasnost. But we're going to see at home there is fear of communists within America. A lot of it stems from that with the communists taking over Eastern Europe, the Communist Party will be established in several nations. Within the United States, there are people who are part of the Communist Party. They never become a big third political party, but we do have fear of the Soviet Union taking over the United States. So people in the 1950s, do they want to be different? Do they want to be different if there's a fear of the communists? No. And so in the 1950s, have you ever seen the Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy shows of back in the day, and everybody always looks the same? It's because people feared the communists, and that they were just a little bit different, they may get assumed being communist. And so loyalty review boards would be created in the United States. We're going to have spy cases all around looking for people who are part of our government who may be spies. And eventually, Ma and Pa Rosenberg will eventually give atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. It turns out Ethel's brother is David Greenglass. He's working on the atomic bomb in Los Alamos, New Mexico. He slips Ethel the information, and her husband is a KGB spy. He slips that information to the Soviet Union, and they get the atomic bomb. And so these people are actually executed in the United States. And this swings that paranoia that communists are being subversive across the nation. Last time when you were doing y'all's map, y'all saw some nations that were red that had little blue dots, and you saw some that were blue that had little red dots. And this was to signify that there were subversive people trying to change their countries. And Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were the epitome of this, and eventually they will be executed and their kids will be taken from them. I know, and so it's a really sad story about them. No one wanted to take their kids because if they took their kids, they were going to be seen as communists. So it's actually this guy in Hollywood he writes songs, who takes their kids in, and their kids become lawyers, and they eventually do this for today for people who are considered terrorists. Their kids are in the orphanage system, and so they set up a system for their kids to be taken care of today because of what happened to them when they were young. Hey, the other guy who's gonna lead to a witch hunt in America, his name is McCarthy. And he's gonna say, how many of you ever just get like feelings about someone? You know something's fishy about them, but you don't have evidence yet. That is exactly what McCarthyism is. He goes around making bold claims that there are spies within our government. He just knows, but he has no evidence. So is anybody gonna believe him? No. And then he eventually says that they're in the army. And they're like, oh my gosh, you're messing with the army. Those people are hand in hand patriotic, stars in their eyes. And so people start to question him. Eventually the U.S. will release classified papers by the 1990s that will reveal most of the people he had on his list were communist. Except the evidence didn't come out till later, when the end of the Soviet Union had fallen, that we were released all their spies. And so he was right, but he will die of alcoholism because no one believed him. Poor guy. I know. Okay. So what we're going to look at is, I know we talked about Stalin being the only one who survived out of World War II because FDR died. Winston Churchill was updated from his prime ministership. And we see Stalin was the only one left around, but Stalin will die. And he will be replaced by this guy named Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev realizes that the life for an average person in the Soviet Union is not that good because they've been really focused on industrialization of military weapons. So he's going to introduce 2 ideas to actually reduce tensions with the U.S. But the U.S. will start spying on them and installing intercontinental ballistic missiles in Greece and Turkey. And this will eventually lead to him down here getting very upset. And in many Eastern countries, shoes are seen as evil. Have you, like y'all know, in many Middle Eastern people's house, do you take your shoes in? No, you take your shoes off because they have the dirt and stuff. And he's very upset. Here's Nikita Khrushchev with his shoe. He's throwing it, and he eventually threw it in the crowd because he's upset of the U-2 spy plane that was caught flying over the Soviet Union, getting information on their installations. And so we know that he will eventually revitalize the Cold War, but one of the things he does do is a de-Stalinization. Stalin had censored the press. He created a cult of personality that they would only report stuff that Stalin wanted out there. And when he realized after his death that the media had been censored and that the opposing people did not get to talk about communism, Khrushchev will open up the press. They're gonna, do y'all see this huge Stalin? The Stalin was not that big. It's a huge statue of him. That they're gonna start removing all of these Stalin statues across the Soviet Union. And so we're ending this very oppressive rule. And there's gonna be more liberalization such as the freedom of the press. And we're gonna see they're gonna rename institutions because everything had like Stalin's name on it. And we're gonna see that historians will get to rewrite textbooks because many of the textbooks were written about the glories of the Soviet Union, especially when they invaded Poland and they killed off the Jewish Pale. They said that was something that needed to be done. And when they will revise the history, they'll talk about the atrocities at Katy Forest. So one of the biggest things that we're gonna move into in this era is the mutually assured destruction. We're gonna start believing in this idea called brinksmanship, and what I like to call brinksmanship is chicken. Do y'all know the game Chicken? Yeah. Like, what happens in the game Chicken?
You gotta wait till the other person backs up.
Okay, so what are they doing first off? Driving two cars, right, at each other, right? Mm-hmm. And the chicken is the one who what? Swerves away, and the guy who's the aggressor keeps on going, right? Mm-hmm. This is what mutually assured destruction is. We're gonna build up, it's nuclear chicken basically. We're gonna build up our arsenals so that the other guy backs out. Are we gonna build them up massively? Okay, eventually when we get to the Vietnam War, we will bomb Vietnam 4 times more bombs than we did in World War II. And that is because we had amassed so much nuclear weapons. We will drop the H-bomb. The H-bomb, let's just think, the atomic bomb would take out Waxahachie. An H-bomb, a hydrogen bomb, would take out the whole DFW area. Okay? It's 67 times more deadlier than an atomic bomb. We see the Soviet spies. Remember Ethel and Julius Rosenberg that I taught back before? They're the ones who are stealing the secrets. Eventually, the Soviet Union gets its atomic bomb, and now we are in this era of mutually assured destruction, which will lead to brinksmanship, which I told you was nuclear chicken. We are going to build up our arsenal in hopes that who? The other side backs down. Okay? So we are going to go to the brink of war, and this will eventually lead to people in the 1950s building atomic bomb shelters. Okay? And there's going to be one significant event of where the Soviet Union starts putting missiles in Cuba that people think that the world is going to come to an end. Because once they start putting missiles in Cuba, it will take 5 minutes for that missile to get to DC. It takes 2.5 minutes for it to get to Dallas. Okay? Let's go to our next crisis. It deals with Egypt. I don't know how many of you do this. How many of you, when you ever go on field trips, ask your parents for money at 2 separate times? Anybody? Hey, Madeline does. Yeah. Why do you do that? Why do you ask Dad over here one day and Mom the next day?
So I can get more?
So you can get more money, and that's exactly what Egypt does. They want to nationalize the canal, but they also want to build a dam, the Aswan High Dam here. Because they know the Nile floods every year, right? Very predictably. They ask the Soviet Union for money. The Soviet Union agrees to give them money. They ask the United States for money. The U.S. agrees. Do you think they're going to find out? And when they find out, do you think they want to keep the money in Egypt? Egypt gets very upset, and they say, okay, U.S., you're going to withdraw the money. We're just going to take control of this canal. And we know this canal is very important because it helps for trade to speed up. They take control of the canal, and they said, we are not going to let Israel use it. And this is going to lead to the UN coming in. And the UN will stop the forces and allow for Egypt to get control of the canal. So the US has just withdrawn money away from Egypt. Who do you think Egypt's going to be friendly with now? The Soviet Union. And so the US is going to start fearing that the Middle East can turn to communism. we're going to have another place that's going to turn to communism, but people were rising up in the Hungarian uprising. The people and the students are crying, SOS, we need help from the U.S. But the Soviet tanks come in. Do you think the U.S. wants to go in if the Soviet tanks are coming into Hungary? No, because if they were to come in, what would happen? A war, and what would we start to use? The bombs. And so eventually the Soviet army will crush the Hungarians, even though they've been asking for democracy, because the U.S. will not go in because this would lead to mutually assured destruction. Okay, so we have been beating them in the nuclear arms race. But one of the things that has occurred is they have gone into the space race. And they have gotten the first satellite into space, which is called Sputnik. This alarms Americans because now they're beating us in the Cold War. So this leads to the United States creating something. It creates NASA. It also does 3 other things. It's going to increase funding to schools because at this time, most high schools only get up to Algebra 1. What math are y'all in? Geometry, Algebra 2. Eventually, they want high schools to go all the way up to calculus. Gosh, you would have been graduating as seniors with just Algebra 1. But because of Sputnik, what is going to happen to math in high school? It's going to go up all the way to calculus. The other thing, they want physics to start being taught into high school. Gosh, next year y'all are going to take physics, right? And the reason that was a choice was because of this little piece of metal that went into the orbit. Okay? So, because of Sputnik, has high school gotten a little bit harder? They're going to increase funding to colleges to increase their science departments and engineering departments. And they're also going to give funding to these universities for research. So Sputnik has sent educational shockwaves that what is going to happen to education at the local level and at the collegiate level. It's going to increase in what subjects? Math and science, nothing to the liberal arts. Okay, the U-2 incident, I had talked about this before. There was a plane flying over the Soviet Union to get reconnaissance. And you have to understand that most of our pilots at this time, what are they, men or females? Men. And you have to understand about most men pilots, they're really, really tall. And they're at a high altitude, so they cannot be detected. But what happens when you're at a high altitude with the air? It's really, really thin, and so if it's really, really thin, what's going to happen to you? Even though they have air masks and stuff like this, what's going to happen to them?
They're going to lose. They're not going to be able to breathe.
Not able to breathe, and then they black out, right? So that's what happened here. He blacks out, so he goes down, and they shoot his airplane. Eventually, NASA's going to go into research about this. They realize that a tall man flying a plane is not the best guy. You need a short, petite female, because their air has less to travel, and so do they black out as much. No, and eventually NASA will start realizing that we need to send women into space, but does that look tough in the Cold War? No, so we'll still rely on men. And we see that they will eventually return this guy, but this is going to lead to increased tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We talked about the Berlin Wall. They're doing it because what is happening to the people in the Soviet Union? Are they staying or are they leaving? They're leaving. And y'all saw it in the video. We're talking about 100,000 a year. Once the wall is built, can people leave? No, it completely blocks them, and we know it stays up to 1991. Our next issue deals with Cuba. Cuba will turn to communism because Cuba had been controlled by the U.S. They've had backed U.S. presidents who have allowed U.S. businesses to take over. Fidel Castro has made an agreement with the Soviet Union that they would trade sugar with them. And in exchange, the Soviet Union wants to install missiles here because that would keep it very close to the U.S. Is this something that the U.S. is already doing against the Soviet Union in Turkey and Greece? So they're like checkmating. And so Cuba will turn to communism. They will declare and they will get support from the Soviet Union, and they will also get weapons. We're going to see at this time JFK is going to introduce the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was already planned under the Eisenhower administration that they were going to send ex-Cuban exiles people who were pro-American that have fled Cuba there to actually overthrow Castro. Castro finds out by espionage this is going to happen. And so when those people are dropped off in the Bay of Pigs, the U.S. only chauffeurs them there, drops them off, and says, peace out, and gets out of the way. They're immediately captured. There's no air support. So how does Kennedy look after the Bay of Pigs invasion? Does he look strong or does he look weak? Weak. And we're going to see this event is going to prompt the Soviet Union that now it could deploy its missiles there. And this will lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is basically the Cubans getting these intercontinental ballistic missiles and getting them operational. Once they get them operational, could they be shot at the U.S.? Yep, we already have ones in Turkey and Greece. And so what will happen, as JFK will say in an ultimatum, he says, if you get these working, it is done. We will go to war. This U.S. puts submarines outside of Cuba, and we're about to have nuclear war. And so for 13 days, people sit on their edge because the Soviet Union is sending their ships. And when their ships meet our ships, what's going to happen? Chicken, nuclear chicken. Who's going to blow first? And what actually happens as their ships are coming from the Soviet Union, U.S. ships are chasing them down. And they're sending death charges. I don't know if y'all know what a death charge is. A death charge is when they don't send out a missile, but they send out the shock wave to seem like there's a missile going. So why are they doing a death charge? So the Soviets could what? Hit back. And it's actually, there's 3 Soviet captains on the submarine. And you have to get an agreement from each of them to submit a missile. 2 of them agree to it, 1 of them doesn't. And it's that guy that prevents nuclear war. We're on the edge of the Cold War at this time. Eventually, the Soviets and the U.S., amidst these 13 days, are negotiating peace. The U.S. and the Soviets will agree that the U.S. will remove missiles from Turkey and Greece as long as what is moved from here. What do we want removed from here? The missiles. Is this going to lead to good relations between the U.S. and Cuba? No. They're going to sour very quickly. But we were on the edge of war right here. Okay? So what do you think is going to happen to bomb shelters? They're going to increase, right? People are fearful. One of the other things that's going to happen in 1979, and this is going to bite us in our butt in the future, is that the U.S. had been making agreements with the Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis called the Strategic Arm Limitations 1 and 2, that we were going to reduce nuclear weapons, but they don't. We just negotiated SALT II with them. And they said they would reduce missiles, but then they invade Afghanistan. So, who do you think the U.S. is going to help? Are we going to sit back or are we going to help Afghanistan? We come in and help. The U.S. will come and train the Muslim guerrilla fighters. We will also bring them in new weapons to fight this war. And this will stem the Soviets from coming in and taking Afghanistan. Eventually, Soviet troops withdraw by 1988. And we see that the U.S. is very successful here, but it's unsuccessful for the Soviets. And the U.S. will stay in Afghanistan. Is that going to lead to bad relations between the U.S. and Afghanistan if the U.S. remains there? Yes, because there's oil there. And eventually, we have trained their soldiers how to fight. We have brought in the weapons for them. And we don't get out of Afghanistan. And eventually, down the road, what is this going to lead to? 9/11. These people have been trained by us because we were helping them against the Soviets. Okay, so now let's get to the end of the Cold War, part 5. Okay, the end of the Cold War actually stems from a lot of policies from Mikhail Gorbachev, glasnost, restructuring, and perestroika. We're going to see the first movement actually happens in Poland, that there's this solidarity movement between laborers, that they want to rise up and they want to have their freedom, and then they're quickly trampled on and crushed. And this sends alarms to the U.S. that we need to come out and help them. And eventually the U.S. will put economic sanctions on them. Mikhail Gorbachev, which if you ever realize Mikhail Gorbachev kind of looks like Khrushchev, but we know that this is Mikhail Gorbachev because he has a huge birthmark on the side that looks like the Soviet Union. Okay? So Mikhail Gorbachev is going to, and this is what I've been saying for a long time, he introduces two ideas, perestroika, which means restructuring, moving away from communism and decentralizing the economy to be more capitalistic. Does that sound like the U.S.? The other thing is glasnost, openness, allowing public criticism. That's freedom of speech. Does that sound like the U.S.? It is his two policies of restructuring their government away from communism towards capitalism, away from a censored government to a more free government where people have more control that will eventually lead to the decline of the Soviet Union. We're going to see Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev will both sign the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty that removes more than 2,600 intercontinental ballistic missiles. And eventually, they will eliminate most of their SS-20 missiles. And so now the Cold War is diminishing. And with these new ideas and the free permits going on in Berlin, we're going to see the Velvet Revolution is going to happen. And so all of a sudden, these nations who started having a little bit more freedom start withdrawing from the Soviet Union. We're going to see they start opening their borders. And we're going to see travel passes are going to be granted East Berlin, and eventually they will tear down the wall. So we saw this in the video, right? Tearing down of the wall. And every single U.S. president from 45 all the way up to Papa Bush will have pieces of the Berlin Wall amongst them. And with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, we will see the reunification of Germany. Germany, East and West, will unite. And the lasting effects of the Cold War is that we see our world, and we ended this bipolarness of communism versus capitalism. We're going to see political borders will shift, the Iron Curtain will be lifted, and we'll get new political opportunities in Eastern Europe. Okay, and we'll see interconnectedness of societies. Okay, the last part is just speeches. JFK will eventually go to Berlin before the Berlin Wall is put up. And he says, we will stand with you, East Berlin. And then he makes a big mistake in German, because he says it in German, the Ich bin ein Berliner. But y'all know German is a very inflective language. And he enunciates on the wrong thing. And he basically says, instead of saying, I am a Berliner, he says, I am a jelly donut. And people just like, what is going on with you? Yeah, just don't try German. Yeah. We're not going to get into Vietnam, because you will get that in more in U.S. This is Vietnam. We had Prague Spring, and we saw this at the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia was trying to get reforms, and then they try to reform, but then they end the revolution, and the Soviet Union sends in the Warsaw Pact, and they're not able to do much. Okay, we're not going to bore you with Vietnam. I already talked about SALT, that we're trying to limit nuclear weapons. Richard Nixon, you will see this next year in the U.S. where he visits China, and we actually recognize mainland China under Mao Zedong versus Chiang Kai-shek's China. Hey, Vietnam, you'll discuss more. Vietnam, you'll discuss more. Czechoslovakia, don't worry that you do that. Okay, Cold War. We already done containment. Truman Doctrine, we talked about this. We talked about the Marshall Plan already. Hey, don't worry about Potsdam. We're done. We got through the Cold War.